Everyone thinks Hollywood is all glitz, glamour, and golden trophies. But behind the flashing cameras and million-dollar deals, there's another side, one they don't want you to know about. This is the story of Sylvester Stallone's brush with the wrong people. The kind of people who don't take no for an answer. After Rocky exploded, Stallone became Hollywood's hottest name. The industry loved him, the audience adored him. And then the wrong kind of people came knocking. They didn't want his autograph. They wanted a piece of him. It started with a friendly offer. A little protection for his newfound success. A business deal he couldn't refuse. Or so they thought. Because when Stallone turned them down, things got ugly. Phones rang at odd hours. Strange cars followed him home. One day, a script he had been working on mysteriously disappeared. And then, one morning, he got a message that made his blood run cold. What happens when a Hollywood star goes up against people who don't play by the rules? Find out in this true story of power, money, and the dangerous side of fame. Sylvester Stallone thought he had made it. After years of struggle, sleeping in bus stations, facing rejection after rejection, Rocky had turned his life around. Hollywood finally wanted him. The studios, the producers, and the agents, they were all lining up. The paychecks were getting bigger, the invitations more exclusive, and the champagne never-ending. But fame has a price. And Stallone? He was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Because in the shadows of Hollywood's bright lights, there were people watching him. People who saw a fresh new face, a star with money pouring in and no real connections in the industry. And they knew exactly what to do next. The invitation. It started with a simple phone call. His agent called, voice buzzing with excitement. "Sly, listen up. You've got an invite to a private dinner. Big names. The kind of people who make things happen in this town." Stallone barely had time to respond before the agent continued. "It's an honor to be invited. No cameras, no press, just real power players. You need to be there." Now, Stallone wasn't an idiot. He knew Hollywood was run by powerful people. But the way his agent said it, something felt off. Still, he had learned one thing from years of rejection. You don't say no to opportunity. So that night, he put on his best suit, stepped into a blacked-out limo, and headed toward a restaurant he had never heard of. The back room. It wasn't some fancy, five-star joint in Beverly Hills. No red carpets, no photographers waiting outside. The place was quiet. Too quiet. A dimly lit Italian restaurant, tucked away on a side street. The kind of place where handshakes meant more than contracts. As soon as he stepped inside, he felt the weight of a dozen eyes on him. Men in sharp suits. Gold watches. The kind of men who never had to ask for a reservation. Someone gestured him toward the back. No names, no introductions. Just a nod. He followed. Through a hallway. Past the kitchen. And into a room where the real meeting was happening. A long table, covered in untouched plates of food. Cigarette smoke is hanging in the air. And, sitting at the head of the table, the man who ran the room. A sharp smile. Cold eyes. Rings on every finger. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't have to, because Stallone had already figured it out. This wasn't a Hollywood producer. The offer. The man leaned back in his chair, sizing him up. "So, you're the kid who made Rocky happen," he said, voice smooth as silk. Stallone forced a smile. "Lucky break." The man laughed. "Luck? Yeah, sure. But luck only gets you so far, kid. Out here, you need friends." A pause. Then the man snapped his fingers. A folder appeared on the table and slid across towards Stallone. "Open it," the man said. Stallone hesitated. Then, slowly, he flipped it open. Inside, numbers, contracts, names. It was a business proposal. The deal was simple. "We take care of you," the man said. "Make sure the right doors open. Make sure nobody messes with you. Hollywood is full of vultures, you know." Stallone nodded. He didn't know, but then the man leaned in. And in return, he smiled. "You help us. Just a little." Stallone's stomach tightened. "Help how?" The man shrugged. "Oh, small things. Certain projects we'd like funded. Certain people we'd like to cast. Certain favors when the time comes." Silence. This wasn't just a business deal. It was an invitation into something much bigger. And Stallone? He wasn't sure if he had a way out. Stallone felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't some Hollywood power lunch. This was something else entirely. The man across the table studied him, waiting for an answer. Stallone glanced down at the folder again. The contracts, the numbers, the list of names. It was all laid out so cleanly, so professional, like this was just another business deal. But it wasn't. He could feel it. He had spent years scraping by, dealing with casting directors who wouldn't give him the time of day, fighting for every inch of progress. And now, here was a man offering to make all of that go away. No more fights, no more closed doors, just success, for a price. Stallone leaned back in his chair. "I appreciate the offer," he said carefully. The man smiled. "Of course you do. But I've always done things my way," Stallone continued. "And I think—" The man's smile faded. "You think," he said, voice turning ice cold. "That's good. Thinking is good." Stallone swallowed. "But let me tell you something, kid," the man continued, leaning forward. "In this town, nobody does things their way. They just think they do." Silence. Then, the man reached for his glass of wine and took a slow sip. "You're gonna be big, Stallone. You already are," he said. "But the question is, how long do you want to stay that way?" Stallone's jaw tightened. The man gestured toward the folder again. "This is just insurance. A little partnership. Nothing to worry about." Another pause. "You're a smart guy," the man continued. "I'll give you some time to think. But don't take too long." Stallone nodded, standing up. Every instinct in his body told him to get out of there. He gave a polite smile, thanked the man for his time, and made his way toward the door. He could feel their eyes on him as he walked out. The entire way back to his car, his heart pounded. He had just been given an offer, one he wasn't sure he could refuse. Back in his apartment, he couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the conversation in his head. He had spent years fighting to make it in Hollywood. But now, he was in a different kind of fight, one he wasn't sure he could win. The next morning, he got a call. Not from his agent, not from studio, from someone who didn't introduce himself. "You had a nice dinner last night," the voice said. Stallone froze. "I hope you're considering the offer," the voice continued. "It's a good one." Then a pause. "We'd hate to see things get difficult." The line went dead. Stallone put the phone down. His hands were shaking. This wasn't just a business proposal anymore. This was a warning, and he had no idea what to do next. Stallone stood in his kitchen, staring at the phone. The words still echoed in his head. "We'd hate to see things get difficult." He wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what that meant. And that's what made it worse. This wasn't a bluff. This wasn't some Hollywood power move. This was real. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had dealt with rejection. He had dealt with being broke. He had even dealt with people laughing in his face. But this was something else. His gut told him to walk away, to ignore the call, to pretend none of this was happening. But he knew better. People didn't just walk away from something like this. So he did the only thing he could do. He made a decision. If they wanted to play games, he'd play right back. But on his terms. The next morning, he showed up at a quiet cafe in Beverly Hills. He didn't call. He didn't set up a meeting. He just walked in and sat down at the farthest table in the back. And waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then 15. Then, a man slid into the seat across from him. Different guy. Same energy. Slick. Confident. The kind of guy who had been doing this for a long time. "You should have called," the man said, sipping his espresso. Stallone shrugged. "Figured this was faster," he said. The man smirked. "So, are you ready to be part of the family?" Stallone leaned forward. "I need to know something first," he said. The man raised an eyebrow. "Who the hell are you guys?" The smirk disappeared. "That's not important," the man said. "It is to me." A long pause. Then the man chuckled. "You don't need to know who we are," he said. "You just need to know that we get things done." Stallone nodded. "Okay," he said. "Then let's talk." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notepad. The man watched as Stallone flipped it open, scribbled something down, then slid it across the table. The man glanced at it, then back at Stallone, then back at the paper, and then he laughed. Not a normal laugh. A cold, knowing laugh. "Smart," the man said, sliding the paper back. but not smart enough. Stallone didn't blink. Maybe, he said, but I'm willing to take my chances. Another long silence. Then the man stood up. No hard feelings, kid, he said, straightening his suit jacket. But you just made a mistake. And with that, he walked out. Stallone exhaled. He had no idea what was coming next, but he had a feeling it wasn't going to be good. The first sign came that night. He was walking to his car when he noticed something. A guy is standing across the street. Just standing. Watching. Not moving. Not talking. Just waiting. Stallone kept walking, pretending not to notice. But his heart was pounding. He got in his car, locked the doors, and pulled out of the parking lot. As he turned the corner, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The guy was still there, just standing, waiting. The second sign came the next morning. A single envelope was slid under his door. No name, no return address, just a simple note inside. Last chance. Stallone crumpled the paper in his fist. He wasn't going to be bullied. Not now. Not ever. But he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Stallone wasn't the kind of guy who ran from a fight. But this wasn't a fight. Not the kind he was used to, anyway. This was something else. Something colder. Something that didn't care how tough you were, how fast you could throw a punch, or how many times you got back up. This was power. And the people he had just pissed off, they had a lot of it. He didn't sleep that night. Not really. Every noise outside his apartment made him sit up. Every car that drove by made him wonder if it was stopping. Every shadow in the hallway felt like it was watching. By morning, he was exhausted. But he knew one thing for sure. He had to get ahead of this. So he made a call. Not to the cops. Not to a lawyer. To someone who actually knew how to deal with these people. And an hour later, he was sitting in a booth at a small Italian restaurant, across from a guy named Vinny. Vinny wasn't a friend. He wasn't even an acquaintance. But he was connected. And right now, that's what Stallone needed. The old man sipped his espresso, watching Stallone carefully. "You got a problem," he finally said. "No kidding," Stallone muttered. Vinny smirked. "You're lucky," he said. "They gave you a warning." Stallone leaned in. "I need to know how bad this gets," he said. Vinny set his cup down and folded his hands. "That depends," he said. "On what?" Vinny sighed. "On whether or not you piss him off again." Stallone exhaled through his nose. "So what do I do?" he asked. Vinny didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper. "A phone number. Call this guy," Vinny said. "Tell him I sent you." Stallone took the paper and slipped it into his pocket. "He'll fix this?" Vinny chuckled. "No," he said, "but he'll tell you if you're already screwed." That night, Stallone dialed the number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, a voice. "You got 3 seconds." Stallone hesitated. Vinny said to call you." A pause. Then, click. The line went dead. Stallone stared at the phone. He had no idea what just happened. But the sinking feeling in his gut told him one thing. This wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning, he woke up to find something waiting for him. A black car, parked across the street. Same spot as before. Same feeling as before. He walked outside like he didn't notice. Like he wasn't watching the way the driver didn't move. Like he didn't feel the eyes on him. He got in his car, drove off, and checked his mirrors. Nothing. For an hour, nothing. And then, he turned down a side street, and there it was. The same car. Following. Not too close. Not too far. Just enough. That's when he realized something. This wasn't about scaring him. Not anymore. This was about control. About letting him know they were watching. And that meant one thing. They were waiting for him to make a mistake. He had to play this smart. So he made a choice. He stopped acting afraid. He stopped looking over his shoulder. He started living his life like normal. Because if they wanted to watch, fine, let them watch. But he wasn't going to break. Days passed. Then weeks. The car stopped showing up. The notes stopped coming. The phone calls stopped. And for the first time in a long time, Stallone felt like maybe, just maybe, he had won. Maybe they got bored. Maybe they moved on. Maybe he was finally free. Then one night, he walked into his apartment and stopped. Because sitting on his table was an envelope. He hadn't heard anyone come in. Hadn't seen anything. But it was there, waiting. He picked it up, opened it. And inside, a single Polaroid, taken from a distance, of him, sitting in that same cafe where this had all started. And underneath it, 2 words. We remember. Stallone's hands clenched, his pulse pounded, and for the first time since this started, he wasn't scared. He was angry, because this wasn't just a warning. This was a challenge, a dare. And Stallone? He wasn't the kind of guy who backed down. Stallone stared at the photo. His fingers tightened around it, his jaw clenched so hard it hurt. This wasn't over. Not even close. They weren't backing off. They weren't forgetting. They were reminding him. And that pissed him off more than anything. He needed a plan. Fast, because one thing was clear. If he just waited, they would make the next move. And that wasn't happening. Not again. He had spent his whole life getting knocked down. And every damn time he got back up, this time would be no different. So he did the only thing that made sense. He went to war. The next morning, he was at Vinny's door. The old man didn't look surprised to see him. "You got something to say?" Vinny asked. Stallone handed him the Polaroid. Vinny glanced at it, then shrugged. "They're still watching," Stallone said. Vinny didn't answer. "I need to know what they want," Stallone pushed. "Because I'm done playing their game." Vinny sighed. "They don't want your money," he said. "Then what?" Vinny leaned forward. "They want your respect." Stallone frowned. "Respect? That made no sense." "They don't need my respect," he said. "They want me to be scared." Vinny shook his head. "They want you to know your place," he said. "They want you to understand that no matter how big you get, no matter how famous, you're still just a guy. And they're the ones who run this town." Silence. Then Stallone nodded. "Fine," he said. "Let's show them who I am." That night, he made a call. Not to Vinny. Not to the cops. To one of them. The same guy who had first approached him about the protection deal. It took some effort, some careful connections, but eventually he got the number. The guy picked up on the first ring. "You got some balls calling me," the voice said. Stallone didn't flinch. "We need to talk," he said. A pause. Then a low chuckle. "Yeah? About what?" Stallone smiled. "You'll see." The meeting was set. A private room at the back of a restaurant. Dimly lit. A single table. When Stallone walked in, there were already 3 guys sitting there. The main guy, Marco, looked up and smirked. "Rocky himself," he said. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" Stallone sat down. No hesitation. No fear. "I'm tired of this game," he said. "So let's talk straight." Marco leaned back. "I'm listening." Stallone folded his hands on the table. "You want me to pay you off?" he asked. Marco shook his head. "No," he said. "That was never about money." "Then what?" Marco leaned forward. "We want you to remember." Silence. Stallone waited. Marco continued. "You think you built this all by yourself?" he asked. "You think you made it to the top because you worked hard?" Stallone didn't answer. Marco smirked. "Every big name in Hollywood got a little help along the way," he said. "Some knew it. Some didn't." Now Stallone understood. This wasn't about money. This was about credit. They wanted him to acknowledge them. To admit, publicly or privately, that he owed them. That without them, he wouldn't be who he was. And that was something he would never do. He leaned forward. "You think I owe you?" he said quietly. Marco smiled. "Everyone does," he said. "At some point." Stallone shook his head. "Not me." Marco's smile faded. "Be careful, Stallone," he said. Stallone stood. "Or what?" Silence. A long, heavy silence. Then Marco shrugged. "Or you might find out what it's like to be nobody again." Stallone walked out. He knew what that meant. This wasn't going away. They weren't finished. They had given him a choice. Either acknowledge them, or what? Lose his career? His life? No, that wasn't happening. If they wanted to take him down, they would have to fight for it. And Stallone? He wasn't the kind of guy who lost fights. That night, he went home, sat down, pulled out a piece of paper, and started writing. Not a script, not a movie, something else. A plan. Because if they thought he was going to roll over, they had no idea who they were dealing with. This wasn't Hollywood. This wasn't some script where the hero loses. This was real life. And in real life, the toughest guy doesn't always win. The smartest guy does. And Stallone? He was about to prove that once and for all. Stallone sat at his desk, his mind racing. He had two choices: play their game, acknowledge them, stay quiet, and let them own a piece of his success. Go all in, push back, risk everything, and prove that nobody owned him. There was no real choice. He had been a fighter his whole life. And this was just another fight. But if he was going to win, he needed a knockout strategy. So he got to work. The first move was making noise. If they wanted him to remember them, then fine, he'd remember publicly. He started telling his story, not the version they wanted, but the truth. The rejections, the struggle, the loneliness. Every interview, every chance he got, he made one thing clear. Nobody gave him a damn thing. Nobody helped him rise. If anything, Hollywood did everything it could to break him. And he still made it. He told it like a fighter, like Rocky himself. The press ate it up. Then, he made move number two. He went straight to the people who hated the mob the most, the studios. If there was one thing Hollywood's biggest players despised, it was the idea that outside forces could control them. And now, that's exactly what Stallone was hinting at. The studios noticed. They saw the headlines. They heard the subtext. And they didn't like what it meant. Because if someone like Stallone could be pressured, then maybe they could be next. So they did the only thing they knew how to do. They closed ranks. Suddenly, the doors that the mob had nudged open over the years started slamming shut. Then, move number three. Stallone made sure he wasn't alone. Because if they wanted to isolate him, if they wanted to remind him who had the real power, he'd remind them that he wasn't the only one they tried this with. He reached out to actors, to producers, to anyone who had been in his position. Some were too scared to talk, but some were ready. And when those whispers started turning into real conversations, that's when the mob made their last move. One night, Stallone walked into his house. It was late, quiet, too quiet. Something was wrong. His instincts told him before he saw it. A single envelope, sitting on the kitchen table. No name, just a photo inside. It was him, taken yesterday. Same clothes, same street. Somebody had been watching. And just below the photo, 5 words. Tom, stop talking, Rocky. The next morning, Stallone showed up at Vinny's shop. He tossed the photo onto the counter. Vinny picked it up, didn't say anything, just nodded. So what now? Stallone asked. Vinny sighed. You made them nervous, he said. Good. Vinny chuckled. That's one way to look at it. What's the other way? Vinny met his eyes. They're thinking about making a move. Silence. Stallone exhaled. He had been expecting this, waiting for it. And now he was ready. It happened the next night. Stallone had just wrapped a meeting with his agent. He walked out onto the street, and there they were. 2 guys, waiting. No words, just a message to send. The first one swung. Stallone dodged. The second one grabbed him, and suddenly it was chaos. Fist flying, grunts, pain. They weren't trying to kill him. They were trying to remind him, to put him back in his place. But the thing about Stallone, he didn't have a place. Because he didn't take orders, didn't back down, didn't lose. So when the first guy went down, the second one hesitated. And that was all Stallone needed. One punch, another, and then silence. They were gone. And so was the fight. The next morning, Stallone woke up sore, bruised, but still standing. And when he checked the news, the headline made him smile. Hollywood star refuses to be silenced. Because now it wasn't just a rumor. It wasn't just whispers. It was public. And that meant the game had changed. The calls came fast. Some were warnings. Some were threats. But one stood out. It was Marco, the last guy he had spoken to. His voice was calm. You made your point, Marco said. Stallone didn't answer. Marco sighed. Fine, you want out? You got it. Silence. Then Marco chuckled. You're either the dumbest guy I've ever met, he said, or the toughest. Stallone smirked. Maybe both. And then, click. It was over. The message was clear. They had tried. They had pushed. And they had failed. Because Stallone? He wasn't just an actor. He wasn't just a name on a poster. He was a fighter. Always had been. Always would be. And if they wanted to take him down, they should have known he was never going to stay down. Because in the end, the real winners aren't the ones with the most power. They're the ones who refuse to quit. And that's why Stallone was always going to win.